Hey, what's the future for serviced accommodation? That's the question I'm going to be focusing on this week. Serviced accommodation got an awful lot of traction, hasn't it, in recent years? My name's Kevin Wright, and I pop up on a weekly video to chew the fat about some finance, property issue or other, based on my 20 plus years experience as a property finance broker, backing that up with 10 years experience as a property finance trainer. Okay, serviced accommodation. Where's that going? Interested? Stick around. Now, a few years ago, you never really heard much about serviced accommodation. HMOs were the big thing. Everyone was talking about HMOs, everyone was getting into HMOs. There was course after course sprung up about HMOs, and then suddenly serviced accommodation started gaining traction. No doubt the inexorable rise of Airbnb played a part in that. So suddenly serviced accommodation became the strategy to get into. Now I was helping the more savvy investors, shall we say, fund their serviced accommodation projects fully 10 years ago. So it's not new, it was just under the radar then. Those guys back then, they made a substantial discovery about serviced accommodation. And I'll tell you about one of the first cases I was involved in that. So it was back in the time of the credit crunch, you remember, 2008, 2009. And these guys had bought a property, demolished it, built a block of 7 flats on there. And at the time, they were struggling to rent out some of them and cover their mortgage costs. The mortgage costs were quite substantial at the time. Now, one of the 7 became vacant, and this was in London, I think Woolwich, if I remember rightly, so pretty close to the centre of London. Now, they just thought that they'd try serviced accommodation. I'm not even sure it was called that then, but they said, look, let's just do a short-term let on this room. Now, what they found was not only did it book out, but if they could fully let it for most of the 30, 31 days in a month, the return was 3 times what they were getting from a normal AST tenant in that property. Now, you're not always going to rent it out fully. So they were forecasting a return of between 2 and 3 times the AST income. Now, as you can imagine, they got quite excited about that and proceeded to, every time a tenant left, convert it over to what we now call serviced accommodation. Now, they needed to remortgage it on that basis to a lender that allowed short-term letting, because one of the terms and conditions that almost every buy-to-let lender has is the minimum rental term allowed is 6 months. Now, if you're doing serviced accommodation, guest is there for an awful lot shorter than 6 months, so you can't do it on a standard buy-to-let mortgage without breaching the terms and conditions. And if they catch you doing that, you've given them the right to call in the mortgage. So you don't want to be trying to do serviced accommodation on standard buy-to-let mortgages. You need specific mortgages set up to do serviced accommodation. So rolling forward from that deal in Woolwich that I had a hand in financing to where we are now, and serviced accommodation has gained a lot of traction, hasn't it, really? There are courses about serviced accommodation. It's something that a lot of people want to get into, not all successfully, I might add. So let's look at where serviced accommodation is likely to go in the future and what options you've got if you want to run a serviced accommodation business. So why has serviced accommodation become popular? Well, it's for the people that want a home from home when they have to stay away, rather than a hotel room. And I certainly get that. Whether you're in a hotel room or a house or flat for a night or two, there's really not much difference in it, really, is there? But if it's a week or longer than a week, or even most certainly a month, you can start to get cabin fever if you're locked up in a hotel room. So that need for space, that need to return to something more like where you would normally live, becomes strong, and that's the pull of serviced accommodation, be they flats or houses. Now, they could be rooms as well. It's possible to rent out serviced accommodation by the room if you've got a house that's big enough to work that way. So I see really two key risks to serviced accommodation in the future. One is you can imagine that hotels are absolutely hopping mad about this competition that's grown up in the last decade that wasn't there for them before. So now not only have they got to compete with other hotel chains, got to compete with all the serviced accommodation operators. And you can be sure that in the background there's some lobbying going on, particularly from the major hotel chains, to bring in curbs on Airbnb type letting. Now, we don't know how successful that would be, but certainly I think there's going to be a clampdown on Airbnb style letting. Now, councils are never backward in coming forward to recognise an income producing, an income generating opportunity. And when the HMO bandwagon really got rolling in the early 2010s, before too long worked out, hey, we can make money out of this. You've got to have a licence, you've got to pay us money to get a licence to run an HMO. And we're going to hit you with a massive fine if we find that you've been running an unlicensed HMO. You don't have to have too many active brain cells to work out that if councils spotted the opportunity to make money from bringing in licences to HMOs, there's a fair chance they're going to spot the opportunity to make a whole new tranche of money by licensing short-term lets, licensing serviced accommodation. I think there's also residential lobbying taking place in varying degrees in various different parts of the country. But certainly in blocks of apartments, the endless trudge of people with suitcases in and out, some long-term residents find that disruptive. And so they would be lobbying to have a ban put on short-term letting. We've already seen how this plays out in HMOs, in that councils in certain areas or even certain streets have brought in Article 4 restrictions. In other words, they've removed the permitted development right to convert a standard residential property into an HMO. You could see the same thing being extended to short-term letting, to serviced accommodation. There'll be parts of town where they ban short-term letting and again introducing heavy fines for non-compliance. So I think the fact that serviced accommodation is going to be increasingly regulated is a given. The question is over what time frame and to what degree. But you could argue that maybe the halcyon days of making money out of serviced accommodation have got a limited lifespan to remain. Now, what other opportunities have you got to create income in the short-term letting market? Let's drill down and have a look at those. Now, you could use HMOs as in a short-term let capacity. Now, you would need to comply with all the licensing, and you couldn't do it in an Article 4 area unless it was already an HMO that you were buying. But there's an opportunity. Now, whether you rent it out as a whole house or whether you rent it out to individuals, clearly there'll have to be locks on bedroom doors. If it has an ensuite, so much the better. If it has simple tea making and facilities and a fridge in the room, again, so much the better. But there's a bunch of people that work away from home, contractors often. They work away from home. Now, they tend to go home at the weekends and come back on a Sunday night or early on a Monday morning, stay until Thursday night and then go home again for the weekend. But the problem for them is it's inconvenient having to lug all their belongings back home every weekend and then bring them back again on a Monday, as they would have to do if they stayed in a hotel. So somewhere where they can leave everything when they go home for the weekend and it will all still be there securely when they come back on Monday, certainly has an attraction. Now, sometimes it would be the company themselves that rented the property and just put their guys or girls in it, or maybe it would be the individual person that rented out the room. So, HMOs have got an angle on serviced accommodation. Now, bed and breakfasts, that's a different angle, isn't it? And it's something that's been popular for decades. In fact, it's been a dream for many people, usually not as a first career, but as a second career. to probably in their 40s or 50s, not say retire to a coastal location, but relocate would probably be a better description. Find a B&B with a few bedrooms, live on site, and run it as a secondary business. Now, these come up on the market all the time, but you really need to look at the issues of whether you want to be actually involved in running a bed and breakfast or guest house. Now, apart from the fact that are you going to be able to actually convince a mortgage lender that you can make enough profit and fill enough of the rooms often enough to be able to get a mortgage? And incidentally, I've recorded a video on why you pretty much can never get a mortgage on a trade-in B&B. Look for the front print here to give you a guide. Go look for that video and see why that's the case.
Hey, have you subscribed yet? If not, click the button there. Oh, and that dingy belly thing there so you don't miss a new video every time I release one. Thank you. And follow me on Instagram too. There's the button down there. Thank you.
Now, apart from all of that, there are other issues to consider if you're going to run it as a guest house or B&B. Now, one is guests are going to want breakfast 7 days a week. Who's going to cook that? Typically, it's the owners. But would you do that, or would you actually employ someone? And is there the money to actually employ someone to do that on your behalf? 2, what about all the linen and laundry services? Beds are going to be changed, towels, everything else like that. Who's going to do that? Can you contract that out? Yes, you can, but is there enough money in the business to be able to do that? What happens when you want to go on holiday yourself rather than entertaining other people's holidays? Of course, you could pick a quiet time of year to do that, and sometimes you would close for maybe 2 or 3 weeks, or you could bring in someone else to operate it whilst you're away, if there's the money to do that. And what's your strategy for finding your guests? Is it Airbnb, Booking.com, local tourist board, or what exactly are you going to be doing? Or discounts for return bookers, in terms of if you haven't got to pay Airbnb for them, you can reduce what you pay returning guests by the commission you would have paid Airbnb. Now, traditionally, guest house or B&B owners live on site. They have a little flat in the property where they live, but I don't see so many of today's investors wanting to do that. They want to be more remote, and they want to have probably multiple establishments, not just a single one, which has been the sort of B&B trade for the last few decades. So it could be your way is less B&B, more serviced accommodation. In other words, you don't live on site, you don't provide the breakfasts, and you outsource all the cleaning. So coastal guest houses and bed and breakfasts are more about holidays rather than serviced accommodation. So holiday lets rather than serviced accommodation. Now, serviced accommodation, as most people understand it now, would be the Airbnb model, where you effectively rent by the room rather than by the week, as you would do with a holiday let, typically. And it's often said that serviced accommodation is in the hospitality business, not the property investment business. And you can see the logic in that, because actually you're offering a very similar service, rent by the night, to what hotels do. Different facilities, of course, that's the appeal, isn't it? So if you're looking to get into serviced accommodation, here's some of the things that you need to consider. Compared to the bed and breakfast or guest house model, which is mainly around holidays, not exclusively so, but mainly around holidays, with serviced accommodation, you haven't got weekly changeovers. You could have daily changeovers in some cases. I mean, of course, there are people that are going to book for longer periods, but your changeover costs tend to be higher, simply because people are checking in and checking out more frequently. Now, the standard of accommodation is generally required to be higher. Now, one big difference between letting a long term, in other words, on ASTs, and letting on short term via Airbnb or whichever, is the standard of the accommodation. When people stay away for a few days, they want something better typically. So they want a higher standard of accommodation than they would if they were living there long term. In other words, when we go away for a few days, we want to treat ourselves to maybe a level of luxury that we don't get in our everyday lives. So expect your Airbnb guest to be more demanding. So in the promotional photographs, your property has got to look that much more appealing to start with. And it's certainly going to be well equipped so that you can appeal to both guests that want to generally just sleep there, eat out most of the time, but also guests that are on a more of a budget and need to be cooking and providing their own meals from within your property. So it needs to be furnished to a higher standard, and it needs to be equipped to a higher standard than you would normally expect with any AST type letting. Of course, it's prudent to supply things like tea, coffee, sugar and those sort of amenities that you wouldn't normally do with an AST type letting as well. How you prioritise the guests that stay also becomes important as well. And the last thing you really need is a bunch of people renting out your property over a weekend to make it party city. Not only is that going to be disruptive to your neighbours, but it could lead to a lot of damage on the property. So you need to establish clear policies about who you will rent to and who you won't. Now, there are some good serviced accommodation groups on Facebook, so joining them would be useful because you could interact with other serviced accommodation landlords and look at some of the problems they're facing and, more importantly, the solutions that they're finding. So just like the B&B or guest house variety, you're going to have a plan for how you get guests, whether it's that mixture of booking.com, Airbnb, direct bookings. A good looking website is never a bad thing, is it? Now, of course, financing any of these things is going to be a big issue. You can't use straightforward buy-to-let lenders because they don't permit let in terms of less than 6 months. And you've got two angles really to approach financing. Now, there are a very small group of buy-to-let lenders that have removed from their terms and conditions the clause that says minimum rental term 6 months. So they do allow you to do short-term lets. We still underwrite it on the basis of an AST letting agreement, but they will permit you to short-term let it. Now, the rates are not going to be great compared with normal buy-to-let mortgages, but you're doing something that you can't do with normal buy-to-let mortgages. And as we said earlier, your rental income should be 2 to 3 times higher, so you can afford to pay a bit higher mortgage rate. Now, if you're just starting out on serviced accommodation with no track record, this is almost certainly the route you're going to have to go down, because the other route is commercial lending. Now, commercial lenders, well, they're a bit different because they want to lend to established short-term let businesses. So when you apply for a commercial mortgage with them, they're going to want to see it again 2 things. Firstly, number 1, they want to see your accounts. They want to see that you can make profits out of renting on a short-term basis. Number 2, they want to see your occupancy levels over a full 365-day period so they can factor in seasonal fluctuations. Now, if your serviced accommodation business has been running in excess of 12 months, you should be able to meet these criteria. And they will base the results of your existing SA business on any new property you want to buy to add to your SA portfolio, on the basis that, well, if you can make that much profit and this much occupancy from what you're already doing, we'd expect you to be able to replicate that on the next property that you buy and we lend on. As with every other mortgage, if you're trying to buy a property with a mortgage, it's going to be based on the lower of the value or the asking price, which means you're going to have to put in full 25% deposit, sometimes even more, possibly up to 35 or even 40%, depending on how much or how little the lenders like your proposition. Now, if you've got ambitions to build a portfolio of these, that's going to be very cash intensive. So you may well need to reappraise your buying strategy, and that would typically be buy something run down, not trading, or trading at next to no profit, which makes it not mortgageable. You buy it with cash or bridging, you run it for a full year, possibly even longer, to get some decent accounts and occupation stats, and then now with a profitable business, we can take you to a commercial lender and get you a commercial mortgage to either pull your cash back out or repay the bridging loan if that's how you funded it. So there we are, quite an in-depth look this week on serviced accommodation, what the future holds. I think it's going to be different to what it's been in the past. It is going to change. it's going to evolve. So there's some insights to work out if you want to get involved in serviced accommodation. Now, I'm going to be back next week with another property finance video, so see you then.
If you enjoyed watching this video, did you know every Monday morning at 8:30 I do a live Facebook Q&A. So if you want to start the week with checking out some answers to your property finance questions, click the link here.